Well, hello, everyone. My name is Heidi Christensen, and I am with the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We are so very glad that you have joined us for today's webinar presentation, Opening Your Doors, Congregational Readiness and Recovery Support, with our very special guests, Drew Brooks and Dr. Dale Ryan, who I'll have the privilege of introducing in a moment. The HHS Partnership Center, as we're known, works to support faith and community health leaders by sharing timely information, models of community-based practice, and resources that we hope will help strengthen the community's capacity to respond to public health initiatives and public health crises, such as the opioid epidemic in our midst. With that mission in mind, today's webinar is the first in our 2018 series of webinars featuring community leaders, talking about the innovative and promising practices they are implementing across the country in response to the crisis of opioid addiction and the need to support those struggling with substance use disorders. We'll be using the Partnership Center's Opioid Epidemic Practical Toolkit for Faith and Community Leaders as a roadmap for the series, so please stay tuned and join us for each of these webinar programs throughout the year. We hope to have a schedule to you in the very near future, but in the meantime, the Practical Toolkit may be found on the Partnership Center's website, and that's hhs.gov/partnerships. And if you are not already on our mailing list, please send your contact information to us at partnerships@hhs.gov, and my colleague Ben will put both that email address and the website URL in the chat box now. Now, last year, the Partnership Center hosted a series of webinars featuring subject matter experts from all over HHS, including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, or SAMHSA, NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and others. And we learned about the opioid crisis, the science of addiction, about treatment and the long road to recovery, as well as pain and pain management. And recordings of these webinars are available if you'd missed them. But today's webinar addresses the practical response, what we can do in our communities to address the opioid crisis, the prevalence of substance use disorders, and the consequences experienced by individuals, families, and communities. But first, a few housekeeping notes before we begin. This is an educational webinar, off the record, and not intended for press purposes. If you are a member of the press, please disconnect, and we will be happy to connect you to the press office here at HHS after the program. And we have a full program today, but welcome your questions and comments throughout the webinar. We hope to share as many as possible with our presenters during the last portion of our program and to gain their responses. Also, if you are having difficulty with your audio, you may find it helpful to call into the number that's on the screen rather than listen through your computer. Sometimes it just works better for sound quality to call in by phone. So, the current opioid epidemic is a priority for HHS and our nation for good reason. In 2016, over 11 million Americans misused prescription opioids. Nearly 1 million used heroin, and 2.1 million had an opioid use disorder due to prescription opioids or heroin. Most alarming are the continued increases in overdose deaths. Preliminary data for 2016 indicates that there were at least 64,000 drug overdose deaths, the highest number ever recorded in the United States. But between the statistics, the headlines, and for too many of us, the upfront and personal experiences in our homes and communities, this epidemic can easily look like a downward, out-of-control spiral. But today and throughout the year, we will hear from community leaders who are implementing hopeful, smart, and compassionate and innovative initiatives in their congregations and communities across the country, where community members walking alongside one another are literally saving people from dying of overdoses, connecting them to treatment and recovery programs, bringing restoration to the lives of individuals and families who have suffered the consequences of addiction, and building the resilience of younger generations and empowering young people with the life skills that will help them make better decisions for their futures. The Partnership Center's Opioid Epidemic Practical Toolkit was inspired and informed by these wise and experienced practitioners. And today we will hear from two of them as we explore the first suggested opportunity in the toolkit, opening community doors and spaces to host recovery and self-help support groups. Now, we know that finding a supportive community is essential to ongoing recovery. Offering space is probably the first thing we tend to think of for congregations and communities to do, because in most cases they are place-based organizations with space and doors to open to groups and programs. But more importantly, they are community and can help diminish the isolation suffered by those with addiction and immediately connect them to others in the community who may also be in recovery. That said, while congregations and communities are poised to throw out the lifelines that these programs can offer, there is much to consider as a community discerns how best to open their doors, their hearts, and their minds to recovery support. But to help us today with this discernment opportunity is Drew Brooks and Dr. Dale Ryan, both calling in from the frigid terrain of Minnesota. Drew Brooks is the Executive Director of Faith Partners, a nonprofit organization that moves around the country providing leadership, administration, and training support to congregations and public-private entities that are partnering with faith-based groups committed to addressing the opioid crisis and supporting community members with substance use disorders. Drew has worked in the prevention, treatment, and public health fields for over 34 years with Hazelden, the Johnson Institute, and other organizations. He has been an informed, enthusiastic, and valued partner to the center since we met last year, and we are so very glad he is here to launch our 2018 webinar series. Drew will be followed by Dr. Dale Ryan, who currently serves as the Associate Professor of Recovery Ministry at Fuller Theological Seminary, and he is the co-founder of the National Association of Christian Recovery. Dr. Ryan also serves as the CEO of Christian Recovery International, an organization helping faith communities become safer and more accommodating places for people recovering from addiction, abuse, or trauma. And he is the author of several books and articles, including 8 Ways Faith Communities Organize for Recovery Ministry, which we will include in a follow-up email to all those who registered for today's webinar, along with a list of resource tips from our community experts with us today. So without further ado, Drew Brooks, would you like to start us off on today's presentation and exploration of opening your doors?
Good morning or good afternoon, I'm not sure. I am so pleased to be a part of today. I thank the Partnership Center for the opportunity to share some of the work we've been doing and to provide hopefully some experience and insight in the process of readiness, creating readiness within the congregation. I'd like to start out with a word picture. I can only imagine, this might date me, but I can only imagine a number of people that are on the webinar has used the services of the AAA. When I was a young child, we would call the AAA and we would say, we want to take this trip. And one of the first things they would ask is, where are you starting from? And that is critical to the whole process of readiness, is where are we starting from? And that's different as an individual, it's different as a group of people, it's different as a congregation, it's different as a community. The next thing they'll ask is, where do you want to go? Do you want to what destinations do you want to go to? So to have a vision of where you want to go is also critical in creating that readiness. And then the AAA, that is the major part of this, is the first one is awareness. What's going on out there? What are my own skills? What role do I see myself playing or my congregation playing? The second A is accepting that. And that is often the most critical one, accepting my role, accepting that the faith community has a major role to play in recovery supports and prevention. And then the third is then to take action. And as I have done readiness and worked with congregations around the country, When you think of readiness, I think of being adequately prepared. That would be one way of defining readiness. So you have a certain set of knowledge, you have a certain set of skills, and you have what you would call just certain attitudes that were consistent with what you wanted to do. To me, knowledge and skills can be taught very easily. It is the attitudes that we bring to this that is most difficult and becomes part of our readiness. And when I look at attitudes, I think of, are people in our congregations receptive to this idea, or are they resistant to this idea? And so how do we work through that resistance and to be curious about that resistance? So that's what I'm really going to be touching on today, and looking at a model to be able to do this. So here we're working with the faith community, and I've been working with the faith community since 1999. I have worked in prevention, treatment, public health, and I'm also personally in recovery and been involved with the faith community all my life. One of the things that had happened being in recovery is I was in a 12-step program, and two things that they talk about is sponsorship and the fellowship of the group. When I went through that, and I continue to do that today, it really revolutionized my whole idea of ministry. Sponsorship was working compassionate ministries and services to our congregations, and then fellowship of the group, we're talking about small group ministry, and that's where I found the ability to develop readiness within people. So this the slide that I have in front of you is one of the things that why does the faith community want to be doing this, or what justifies it? I see this as probably one of the main things. We want to have compassion. We want to show God's mercy. We want to bring hope to the hopeless, comfort the afflicted, freedom to those enslaved by addiction. One of the most common denominators of major faith traditions is the golden rule. And you just think about that as, if you had such a disease, how would you want to be treated? And that is really what the golden rule speaks to. I would love to see this addiction, this chronic illness, to be a casserole illness, where when somebody experiences this within your congregation, you surround them and you bring casseroles to them and you surround their family. That would be moving into readiness, where the whole congregation would embrace this ministry. The next slide I'd like to look at, this really provided some reinforcement and justification for what we do. This was done by Joseph Califano from the Columbia University, the National Center of Addiction and Substance Abuse. What he found, and this is an old study, but it's a landmark study, that 94% of clergy saw this as an important issue. That's a lot. That's a major group of people. But then you look at the third bullet, 12% have actually received some training in their seminary training. So what we saw was a huge gap, both for readiness for clergy, and also we saw an opportunity, because we saw in the faith community that maybe clergy weren't equipped, but the people sitting in the pews often were. They were health educators, they were counselors, they were law enforcement officers, there were people in recovery. So to be able to tap into that. So these stats just reinforced our ideas of, we need to equip the clergy, but we also need to equip the laity. And then the middle stat, 38%, I often ask, is that, you see that as low or high? And what we discovered is that clergy often saw that as low. And so 38%, what we often found is that the clergy in their pastoral care would talk about, they would talk about finances, they would talk about marital relationships, they would talk about parenting, but often underlying potentially was substance use disorders or substance abuse. So it just verified the reason that for the equipping. We also discovered that oftentimes the faith community and the science community are like two ships passing in the night. And what we wanted to do is to marry the two, is to bring together the strengths of the faith community and the strengths of the science community. And that was true in my own person, and that's what created the readiness as an individual. So what is our path to readiness? In our model, we talk about the readiness phase. That's the front end, involving people, getting people interested, having them walk through that acceptance process of that there is this issue, that there are problems, and that there's something that I can do about this. And then we move into the developmental phase, or capacity building, and then ultimately the sustainability phase. So this is not just a flash in the pan, but it's something that can last for a long time. We have some team ministries that have been going on for 15, 16, 17 years, which is not often the case. So again, the definition that we want people to be adequately prepared, and that it's measurable so we can systematically enhance it. And that is a lot of what we did in our work. We have been working with SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration, went through an evaluation process with the Service to Science, and wrote an article, research article on readiness and capacity building. So we have embraced the science as well as the faith. We have also worked with 22 faith traditions, all the main faith traditions, and worked in numerous states. Here are some measurements or measurement tools. Just very simple. Existing efforts. Has the congregation had existing efforts like a health ministry or a compassion ministry, an outreach ministry? All of those types of ministries can be precursors, can help with inviting this type of service to your congregation. The next is the knowledge of the efforts. In my own congregation, we had a counseling Stevens ministry, and they had it for 7 or 8 years, and probably less than half the people knew that it existed. So to be able to do a better PR job, to let people know that this kind of service is available within your congregations, and there's multiple ways to make that happen. Do you have leadership support? We did both focus groups and interviews of key leaders, and found out that the main things that add to the success of these efforts is that there is clergy support. If the clergy is not on board, it will not happen. That's commonsensical, but we have found that to be true so many times. The other is that there needs to be a layperson that takes this on, that becomes the champion and helps move this forward. That in combination will make this happen. The next is knowledge of the problem. One of the faces of denial is ignorance, and we don't know what's going on out there, such as with the opioid epidemic. What is happening? What are other substance use disorders? What are other addictions? What's relapse? What is the brain research saying? What is happening in this field? So that's another. Available resources is critical. What kind of resources does congregations have? And to be able to be connected to community resources once they butt up against their limitations. So to be able to create those relationships so there can be that warm handoff. And then the last is really the community climate. Is it accepted to be able to talk about this within the congregation? I remember one pastor that he also was in recovery. He would do a 2-sentence prayer on his recovery date. And he would say, Lord, I pray for those, I thank you for my recovery, and I pray for those still suffering. And that just opened the door for the congregation to look at this issue. So what are some strategies and tools? There's a number of strategies and tools, and here are some key ones. We have developed in the readiness phase just to be able to cast the large net. In working with, for instance, we're currently in Muhlenberg County, Kentucky. We would send out to all the clergy just a 10-question survey, just asking them questions around their knowledge, their experience. Would they be ready to participate? Would they be willing to participate? And basically, readiness is about people taking a step towards you. And so the ones who would fill out the survey and send to us, they would move from a cold call to a warm call where, yes, I would like to participate and learn more about this. Key faith leader interviews. Find out who already is doing some things in your community. Interview them. What do they see as some of the issues? What are some of the resources? What's worked? What has not? So we've developed just a little questionnaire to be able to do interviews with key faith leaders. Focus group questions, meeting with ministerial associations, clergy associations, and finding out what do they know about this topic? What do they need to know about this topic? What resources do they have? What do they see as promising in efforts in working in this area? And then in our development phase, having a toolkit where congregations can have education materials as well as some consultation on how to build congregational support. Because we see this being done with the whole congregation, not as a stepchild where we have maybe a recovery support group that is in one room and everyone knows what room, but nobody enters in. So to have it be part of the fabric of the congregation. And then the last is, and this was really our work with the Service to Science Evaluation, is have a pre-test and a post-test, basically a 26-question questionnaire where we would find out, are you ready to involve yourself in this? What problems are you currently experiencing? What would you be open to? And so there's some tools. Excuse me. This is just an aggregate of some of the congregations we dealt with in that 9-month time period. 33 congregations, 3,000 respondents, 7 different faith traditions in that aggregate, 10 different states that were involved with that particular aggregate. Some of the things we found out, and this is what we've seen, and that was 2007, 2008, is it's consistent in the present as well. So for instance, when we look at alcohol, having a family member having a problem with alcohol, 30%, so 1 in 3 people basically in your congregation having a family member. And often it's not necessarily the addict that's sitting in the congregation or the person with this disease that's sitting in the congregation, but it's the family member. So how do we equip them to be able to respond? 17%, 1 of 6 with drug problems, food problems, work, gambling, and other. The big one there is what we find is internet pornography. What we have found is we asked did some surveys around this and learned that what was the average age of first exposure to internet pornography was 8 years old. So we look at other things besides the substance use disorders and create that readiness. And what ends up happening is you develop an educational platform to look at both substance use disorders, but then maybe mental health issues, suicide prevention. So it is creating that readiness and capacity once you have opened the door to this. As you look at this, who do I go to in the congregation? About 60% didn't know who to go to. When you have a team that is eliminated, people know where to go to. When we looked at community, it was a 50-50 shot. Half of the people didn't know where to go. And that is what these teams educate themselves on and create readiness to be able to respond. This is an interesting slide. We asked, would you support programming around addiction, recovery, prevention? 75 to 80% said yes. But the interesting piece is would you participate in these programs? That was closer to 35 to 40%. So part of getting ready is to move people from just supporting to actually participating. And there are strategies to do that as well. So here we looked at our surveys. We had 4 different domains. We looked at self-efficacy, where you feel capable of doing this. We looked at, you see this as a supportive environment. What are your attitudes towards addiction and recovery? And do you have your own experience with addiction? What we found, I'll cut to the chase, is the experiences didn't seem to be statistically significant. An example of that, we worked with some congregations in Madison, Wisconsin, and after the training, a woman came up to me. She said she was 24 years in Al-Anon, which is for a support group for those with family members of people with alcoholism. She goes, I've been in this program for 24 years, but I don't. And I said, well, why don't you think you can do this? And she said, people don't know me that way. And I just thought, I didn't say this, but I thought to myself, I'm just so sorry that your recovery is so small. And I don't mean to be judgmental, but she had an opportunity to create permission to be an advocate for recovery. And she chose not because she wasn't ready. And so to create that readiness. What happens over the training process, you see the pretest, the last 2 somewhat and very ready, about 43% thought they were ready. 18 months later, closer to 62, 63%, which is really getting over a tipping point. Over half the congregation sees themselves as being ready. So I'd like to just share a little bit about the model. We are there to equip, and there used to be a thing called one church, one addict, and it would be one person being that person in recovery. And we thought, well, that person often would feel like a lone voice in the wilderness. So we thought, let's do this in a team approach, where you have your own cloud of witnesses, where you have the support of the people around you in greater capacity to do the work. Generally, any kind of service or ministry in a congregation takes 3 to 5 years to establish. Obviously, a lot happens within the first couple of years, but where it becomes part of the fabric of the congregation and the church or the temple or the synagogue or the mosque becomes ready to respond to people. This can happen with small congregations of 25 to 40, it can happen, and we've worked with that size, or thousands of people. People need to just get started. And so we look at, can you provide some information and awareness? Pamphlets, brochures. I remember when my father died in 1990, I went past Care Notes and I saw something on grieving, and I read the pamphlet, and it said that my feelings were normal and that I wasn't alone, and that's all I needed to hear. We can do education on relapse and recovery and how does alcoholism and drug dependency affect the family, and brain research and all the different educational opportunities. To develop referral happens constantly through pastoral care, but to make that more efficient, to expand that pastoral care, to develop programs, hopefully evidence-based programs, to bring in curriculum, to bring in video series on this particular topic, and ultimately do a team ministry, which is what we train people to do. And then to have it institutionalized, where you're part of the congregation when you have a budget line item. You're part of the congregation when you become accountable to the governance. And so it doesn't become a stepchild of the congregation, but it becomes integral to the congregation. This is where we have been in that 4-year period. It is equipping a team. It is looking across the whole continuum of use. When you look at abstinence, it's about 30% of the population of drinking age, and this is for alcohol. 30% of the population abuse or have harmful consequences or become dependent. So you have 40% in the middle, basically a bell-shaped curve. So there are ministry points, places to serve your congregation along that whole continuum. And so we need to be ready across the whole continuum. An example of that I will share in just a moment here. So here are the 5 areas of ministry. Prevention. We believe in prevention across the lifespan. So from birth to death. And where this happens, the older population, the largest growing population of alcohol abuse is the older population. So to be able to do prevention in times of transition, grade school to middle school to high school to college, marriage, having your first child, divorce, losing a job, losing a spouse, retirement, all the different transition points become points where people are vulnerable and need to have knowledge, support, and skills to navigate through that. What better place to do that than in an intergenerational setting such as the congregation? Early intervention, stepping up into alongside people when they're experiencing issues. Referral assistance, getting them to the help they need, so having a relationship with community resources. Recovery support, which Dr. Ryan will really speak to more so. And then advocacy. Feeling comfortable with your own story in your own skin, whether you chose to abstain or that you are in recovery or that you use and need guidelines. You have a story, and to be able to communicate that is creating that readiness. So here are some levels of advocacy: readiness with self, readiness with seeking help, readiness with getting education, readiness with looking at this as a congregation, readiness with looking at this on a legislative level. That's the roadmap to build support, to equip the leaders, and to develop the teams and sustain the ministry. And then the last slide I'd like to share is there's a missional focus. That is one thing to look at. That's what shapes this or determines the direction. Is it a social justice focus? Is it a teaching focus? Is it a compassion focus? What's the focus of the congregation? That will help with readiness. Congregational needs, what are they experiencing? What's the age group that you have? Capacity of team members. What have they experienced? What do they bring to the table? And then the receptiveness or readiness of the congregation to receive the information. So with that, I'll close and hand it off.
Right when I was ringing those chimes. Drew, it was a lot to cover. Thank you for taking your broad experience, your portfolio of work, and trying to condense it for our audience today. I just think this image that you're creating of a journey, starting where you are, and that willingness to move forward and what can open up for you. But thank you so much for that foundational presentation. And so now we're going to move to Dr. Dale Ryan, who's going to share with us his work and the different models of recovery support and what that might more specifically look like in communities, in faith and community organizations. Dr. Ryan?
Hi, everybody. Just a brief alternative introduction. My name is Dale. I'm a recovering work addict, a recovering religious addict, a recovering codependent, a recovering survivor of childhood spiritual and emotional abuse. I'm not going to give you the whole list. It's kind of a long list, a ridiculously long list. But I just want to suggest that I'm here primarily just as another bozo on the bus, rather than someone with a lot of degrees and so on. My specific task for the second half of the hour here is to talk about specific strategies that local faith communities can use to do recovery support, to use Drew's categories. And I'm going to try to have time to look at 8. I may only get to 7, but we're going to send you out a copy of an article that I wrote some time ago looking at these different basic strategies. The first one is pretty familiar to all of you. It's what I call AA in the basement. This means that the church agrees to let some 12-step fellowship use the facilities of a church to hold meetings. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who are sober this morning because local faith communities have let 12-step fellowships meet in their facilities. So it's a great strategy. It's a very effective strategy. There are certainly some faith communities that have used this as their primary involvement in recovery support. I know churches that, if you look at their church calendar, it looks like an Alano clubhouse or a 12-step clubhouse. They'll have multiple 12-step meetings every day of the week, in addition to their other church programming. So it's a great strategy. I think of it as kind of an entry-level involvement. It just requires letting people use a facility. But it's a great way, I think, an entry-level way for churches to get involved in recovery ministry. The second strategy requires a little more explanation. I call it bridge strategies. And what I'm referring to here is that often people have to come to terms with the fact that recovery culture is different from the culture of their faith community. So let's imagine someone who's a member of a faith community winds up with the substance abuse problem. They either, get sick and tired of being sick and tired and self-refer to AA or something, or they get court referred there or whatever, have an intervention done on them. They wind up in recovery culture. They take it seriously. They get a sponsor. They start working the steps. They start to put together some consecutive sobriety. Maybe they have a year of sobriety. Maybe they're into somewhere in the second year of sobriety. But somewhere in that process, what floats to the surface is the sense that I'm a bicultural person. I got one foot in recovery culture and another foot in the culture of my faith community. And I think there's something really fundamentally good about being a bicultural person, but sometimes it can be really disorienting. For example, comes to mind a friend of mine who said he would go to his home group in AA and he could talk about his recovery. No one has any problem with anything he says. Everybody gets it. He doesn't have to explain anything. If he talks a little bit about his faith, that's not a problem either. But if he says too much about his faith, people get anxious. Someone might take him aside and say, it's just not the right place for that. And on the other hand, if he goes to his faith community, he can talk about his religious convictions and his faith as much as he likes. It's not a problem. Everybody gets that. If he talks about his recovery a little bit, that's okay too. But if he talks too much about his recovery, people start to get anxious. They don't quite understand. He's got to explain things. And there's a kind of longing developed to have a place where you can put these two cultures together somehow, where you don't have to explain your recovery stuff and you don't have to explain your faith stuff either, because everybody gets it. Now, there's no simple graphical way to show that, but there's this interest in creating a space where these two cultures overlap. The instinct is not to replace the resources of recovery culture or to replace the resources of the faith community, but just to have some space where you can integrate these two parts of your life. I think bridge is the central metaphor here. You want to have some bridge between these two cultures that have both had a powerful impact on your life. And typically the way this would emerge is someone would go to the leadership of their faith community and say, can we start a 12-step group here at the church? It's not an AA group. It's not going to be the same as what I do in recovery culture. And it's not going to be the same as the stuff I do at church either. But it's intended to provide a bridge between these two cultures. Now, for this, I probably could come up with a list of 1,000 churches in the U.S. who have strategies of this kind in place. It's pretty common. For people who actually participate in these kinds of bridge strategies, it can be a really profound integrating experience. It seems to me to often be a really important dynamic if you're working on step 11 of the 12 steps, where you're seeking conscious contact and trying to put together the particular way in your faith tradition handles prayer and meditation and integrating that with your recovery experience. Every strategy I'm going to talk about today has strengths and limitations. I think the strength here of bridge strategies is for people who participate, it's just a really profoundly moving experience often, and deepens their commitment both to participation in recovery culture and in their faith community as well. The limitation is it really typically doesn't have much of an impact on the faith community. It's kind of marginalized within the faith community, still, it's pretty powerful experience, well worth considering as a base strategy. Thirdly, the third strategy is what I call we can do it better strategy. This requires even a little bit more explanation, but sometimes faith communities will have a real negative attitude about recovery culture. They'll say things like, we want to have a program consistent with our core values, not a program that's shaped by some outside enterprise. And you find this in faith communities, sometimes in more conservative faith communities. I just want to say three things about this kind of program. First, it is worth noting that this instinct that we want to focus on our core values and not be shaped by someone else's stuff is in fact very similar to Tradition 6 of the 12 traditions of AA. An AA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise. I think there are some practical differences between these two instincts. I think at root there's a lot in common here about being a community that maintains its commitment to its core values and doesn't get distracted by outside enterprises. I think for me, I have a really positive attitude towards Tradition 6 in AA. I think it accounts a lot for its resiliency over the years. And is a really important part of recovery culture. My own personal instinct is not quite so positive when I see this in a faith community, but I think noticing the similarity between those instincts might help us to appreciate why certain faith communities have this kind of stance towards outside enterprises. Second thing I'd say about faith communities of this particular kind who want to do their own program and really want to do it better than the way other people do it is that we're probably talking about communities that are at elevated risk for significant substance abuse problems for a variety of reasons. Just the hesitation to access external resources puts a community at higher risk. But should a faith community like this, and I've known communities like this, to want to be involved in recovery ministries, they're going to develop some alternative program. It might, in fact, be a 12-step program, but they're going to add a lot of language to the 12 steps that makes it a little bit more acceptable to their particular religious tradition. They'll add a lot of stuff to make it more acceptable to the people that are part of their culture. I think that there's a key question that's worth asking about programs like this, and it's this. I think the most important question to ask is what are people encouraged to do when they do this program? This comes, I think, is a question shaped by 12-step experience. It is, the 12 steps are not 12 ideas, 12 principles, 12 dogmas. They're 12 suggested things to do. The question is always, are you willing to do? Are you prepared to do the things that need to be done? So about programs of this kind, we can do better strategy programs. I always ask, what is it that people are actually being encouraged to do? I try to look past any kind of religious specific religious language that's been added to make it more acceptable to a particular tradition. Get down to what is it really that people are encouraged to do. If what people are encouraged to do in this program is to try harder to make better choices, it's not going to work, right? We kind of already know that. So it's going to sort of die under its own weight because they haven't come to terms with powerlessness yet. But if you look at the program and the kinds of things that people are actually encouraged to do resemble the kinds of things that people in 12-step programs are encouraged to do, and they haven't left out any of the major spiritual practices like self-examination in 4 and 5 and confession and making amends. If all of that stuff is included in there, there's some chance that this is a program that could be really helpful to people. And it may be the only kind of program that can be sustainable in certain kinds of faith communities who are resistant to external resources. I could say a lot more about this, but we are time limited here. A fourth way that faith communities sort of organize to do recovery has to do with what I call a recovery department. The larger a faith community becomes, the more likely it is to organize itself internally around some kind of corporate model. There'll be a senior management team and a series of departments. They'll have a worship and music department, a children's education department, and so on. Larger faith communities, there might be 8 or 10 such departments. So the logical way to kind of get recovery integrated into this kind of faith community is to add a recovery department. The premise of a recovery department is probably you have a variety of different things going on. It's more than just having recovery groups, but you might have open 12-step groups, you might have big book studies, you might have speaker meetings, those kinds of things, the kinds of things you'd find in a 12-step clubhouse. But you're also going to have a lot of other things around that. You might have simple things like sober Super Bowl parties or sober New Year's Eve parties, because you're in the process of building a community of people within this faith community, and they need opportunities to socialize that are safer than the other opportunities that are available to them. You might also develop, I think, the kind of strength of a department strategy emerges when you think about family interventions. What comes to mind is a guy who went to his faith community on Saturday night because they had a kind of bridge strategy group, primarily populated by people whose home group was an AA. His wife would go that night as well to go to an Al-Anon kind of group, and his elementary age kids would go to the program that the recovery department had put together for children from homes where there's substance abuse. And his older daughter went to a group that the high school department at the church, the faith community had developed, again, for kids from substance abusing homes. And there was something quite magical about that family systemic intervention in the family system. What this guy told me once was, sometimes we drive home, all of us, from Saturday night, and we're talking about what we learned in our groups, and we're all talking about the same thing. That's a really powerful systemic intervention in the family system, and that's the kind of magic and wonder that is possible when you have this kind of broad-based intervention that a department strategy offers. There's, of course, a wide range of things that you might also do here, some educational components, some faith components. You might have recovery Bible studies and those kinds of things that would all be part of a recovery department. Fifth approach it has to do with treatment-related strategies, and there's quite a few churches, quite a few faith communities that have got engaged in recovery support by building working relationships with treatment programs. And You can start this just by visiting treatment programs closest to your faith community and asking them, what do they need? Maybe they'll say, well, we've got some leaky plumbing. We need a plumber. We can't afford to pay for it. And so you got a plumber in your congregation. You put together a work team. Go help them with that. Maybe they need food service for Thanksgiving, something special. I'd like to focus on a couple much larger possibilities here, though, and that is that sometimes you see faith communities that actually start treatment programs, and sometimes you see treatment programs that start faith communities. Let me talk briefly about each of those. Sometimes faith communities start treatment programs. I suppose Salvation Army is the best example in the American context. Over 100 and so adult rehabilitation centers with programs of various kinds for people with substance use disorders. But I'd like to mention an example that has a number of features I really like, and that is the program at Qasr el-Dubara Church in Cairo, Egypt. A wonderful example of a church with a very robust recovery program. They decided some years ago, I can't remember exactly when, but they decided to start a residential substance abuse treatment program. Their first facility was 60 beds, which at the time doubled the number of treatment beds in the entire country. Primarily opiate addiction that was the focus of their treatment program. They were, of course, this is a Protestant church in Cairo. It was sort of a minority religion in that context, the traditions being Islamic faith or Coptic faith. And so program participants came predominantly from the Islamic culture or the Coptic culture, with some minority members from the Protestant culture. And they managed to hardwire into the DNA of the treatment center this sort of interfaith distinctives that was necessary to be effective in that context. And I haven't kept up to date in the last 4 or 5 years with what they were doing, but I think they have 5 or 6 different facilities around the country. It's an example of what a single local faith community can do that actually impacts the national effort to combat opiate addiction in that particular context. I think they deal with other issues than opiate addiction, but it was their primary emphasis in the early years. The inverse of that can also happen. There are sometimes treatment programs actually start faith communities. My favorite example of this relates to a conversation I had a couple years ago with a guy who was an exit counselor, a social worker who was an exit counselor at a Salvation Army treatment program. And his job was to counsel people who had successfully completed their year-long program. So they had about a year's sobriety. And one of his tasks was to, if you do a 30-day program, you realize pretty quickly 30 days isn't long enough. If you do a year-long program, you realize eventually a year-long program isn't long enough. This is a lifetime issue, and we should be developing longer-term resources. So he's sitting there looking at these people leaving the program, knowing that he's supposed to find churches he can send these people to, or other kinds of faith communities that he can send them to, and he just has a terrible time finding places that are good fits. So eventually they say, we should be doing something for our alumni. We can still refer them to faith communities if there's things out there, but we really need to be doing something for our alumni who can't find places like that. They start off with a once-a-month gathering on a Saturday night. They'll get together. They'll sing some songs together, some hymns. Someone will give a talk. Sometimes it'll feel like a speaker meeting. Sometimes it'll feel like a sermon. Then they'll have a meal together. And it's all of a sudden it's sort of feeling like a faith community. People are inviting their friends that they meet at their home groups or elsewhere to come check it out, see if it might be helpful to them. It's really a kind of grassroots faith community coming out of a treatment context. I think we're going to see more of that kind of thing as time goes on. I want to say very briefly something about what I call a recovery-friendly faith community. Drew already talked about this a bit. There are ways to become friendly to people in recovery without actually offering support groups, for example. Just putting the contact phone numbers for local intergroups for AA and NA and so on in the church bulletins or to whatever kinds of paper gets passed out, church weekly mailings to the congregation. That can change the kind of shape of the congregation. Finally, I want to say something about what I call the faith community in recovery, and ask you to imagine for a moment what it would be like to, in Protestant context, it's called church plant. What it would look like to plant a church in recovery culture, not sort of help a existing congregation be more recovery friendly. What would it look like to have recovery at the core DNA of a faith community, where everything you do was shaped by recovery dynamics? There are now some wonderful examples of that kind of thing. In the mailing later, I'll give you some links to this kind of stuff, so I don't have time to talk about it now, but what comes to mind is the Recovery Church in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Mercy Street in Houston, Texas, and North Community Fellowship in Virginia, of different faith communities who've got recovery as part of their core DNA. It results in a very different kind of dynamic. I think my time is more than up. I should probably stop.
Well, we do wish you could continue, but I think, thank you for that, Dr. Ryan. And I know you and I are going to pull our heads together and create a list of some of these references that we can send up in the second of our 2 follow-up emails. One will go out that just has the recording of today's webinar, and then you and I will be sending out a second follow-up email that has some of the resources, your paper on the 8 ways that recovery ministry can be discerned for a community, and then perhaps we can include some of these other references so we can extend both your all's presentation through that follow-up email. We are at the end of time. I know we had a few questions come in. I know there was a couple of folks who were talking about how to engage and work with other churches and other community partners, and I know we will be getting to that. One of the suggested areas of practice in the practical toolkit is to collaborate with community partners, and we'll be doing a deep dive on that later in the year. So I want to just thank you both for just starting us off. I know this was foundational. You touched on so many important concepts just about the journey of the road. Start where you are, the idea of a recovery culture. How does that begin? How does it marry with that of faith and other community organizations and their mission? Such great questions. Thank you both so very much, and thank you all who participated today and for the work you're leading around the country. We are so very thankful for everything that we learn about and the bright spots that just shine every single day. So just to say, we will be sending out a follow-up email. Stay tuned for that. If you're not on our mailing list, you'll see that our email contact is up there and our website is up there. Be in touch. Thank you, each of you, for all that you do every day. And thank you to our speakers once again. All right, have a wonderful afternoon, folks.
Hello.